Hello everyone, and welcome to my response video to 6 ridiculous myths about the Middle Ages everyone believes on crack.com. Yes, it's over a decade old, but misinformation knows no time, and I want to see which ones they get right and which ones they get wrong. So let's start off. When you think of the Middle Ages, chances are you picture gallant knights sitting astride brilliant destriers. Well, knights really did ride destriers. Though the situation varied, knights would have different horses for different situations. Destriers would have mostly been ridden into battle and jousting and such. They probably would have rode different horses if they were just casually out, though that also depends on the wealth of the knight and how much they could afford. Let's see, galloping through a sea of plagues, filth, and ignorance, and you can hardly be blamed for that when everything from the movies you watched to your high school teacher, who was mainly the football coach, has told you that. Okay, so I would mostly blame movies on it. That being said, there are some pretty bad high school history courses. But also, pretty much all my high school history courses did talk about advancements that went on in the Middle Ages, both scientific and sociological. So, scientific process was dead. The myth, they call it the Dark Ages for a reason. Any scientist who dare study the universe would be shut down by the Catholic Church, which thought all that bullshit was immoral, and the Bible was all the learning anyone could need. Even thought the earth was flat, for crying out loud. And now, let's see the reality. Aside from the fact that, as we already explained, most people in the Middle Ages did not think the earth was flat, well, I should say that the educated class in the Middle Ages did not think the earth was flat. We don't really know how widespread the knowledge of the earth being round was in the overall population. Like, if you asked for randomly killing if you ask some random peasant whether they thought the earth was flat or round, would they know it was round? Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. We don't know for sure. But anyway, the church wasn't responsible for killing science. On the contrary, it was largely responsible for saving it. After the barbarians invaded Europe and Rome went the way of the dinosaurs, the Eastern Roman Empire would heavily disagree with that statement. The Catholic Church was the last remaining aspect of Roman culture in Western Europe. Sort of. So, especially if we're talking about the early Middle Ages, which is what people most often refer to as the Dark Ages, there were other aspects of it, like many of the Goths that kept Roman institutions around. As well, and so the various Gothic kingdoms in Italy did have some Roman institutions that they kept around, and also there were remnants of Roman culture that passed on. The church went about setting up monasteries across Europe, and along with books came the monks' massive libraries. This is correct. Monks were just about the only educated people in the early Middle Ages. This is incorrect. While they were among the educated people, anyone who was a priest would have also been educated, and a bunch of other nobles would have been educated as well. That being said, I will say that technology did stagnate in some places, and pretty much everything we know about this entire period was written by them. Well, a lot of it was, not all of it was, though. Like, there were people other than monks who wrote, and assuming we're talking about the early Middle Ages, there were historians who wrote about that period who weren't monks, more so came on then, but yeah, monks did preserve and write a lot of knowledge, so mostly correct, I'd say, but also fairly basic. As time went on, the church stepped it up a notch and started establishing universities to foster the preservation of knowledge. You may have heard a few of them: Oxford, Cambridge, and University of Paris, to every other top university of Europe. At these universities, study more than most college kids do, with an average bachelor's degree taking 7 years to learn, master's or doctorate taking more. The universities were also big on translation. Okay, so universities were corporations at the time, incorporated with the church. That doesn't mean the church is set up or established all of them themselves. It just means that, though they did set up some, but it means that people have worked with the church to set them up. The universities were also big on translation, having successfully translated into Latin guys like Aristotle and Plato, which effectively made the Renaissance possible. Oh, this is despite the fact beer bong technology was infancy. Okay, so yeah, there was a translation of things into Latin, of Greek works. The medieval guys really liked Aristotle. they basically agreed with Aristotle on most of his philosophy items. Around the same time as universities were popping up all over Europe, the Crusades were bringing Europe into contact with advanced Muslim ideas of science and technology, including things like algebra. Ideas like the compass and astrolabe came to the west via Muslim Spain and came in handy at Arab exploration. Italian merchants came back with North Africa and came up with another innovation, Arabic numerals. And also made advancements thanks to the university system. Contrary to popular belief, dissection of torches was fine and dandy with the church and medieval universities in the basement. Okay, maybe it wasn't totally fine and dandy. By the 14th century, there were functioning hospitals, and doctors learned how to use antiseptic while lopping off people's body parts. And good thing filmed then, because, right, okay, yeah, this is mostly correct, though, once again, there could be more elaboration, but I'm gonna give it credit. Though, once again, there are still some things they got wrong, and are heavily oversimplifying. Now, everyone smelled like complete shit. Yeah, so, in the Middle Ages, we know everyone was absolutely filthy. Medieval peasants looked like something straight out of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and the upper classes were hardly, this is them describing the myth. People back then took baths without going to the dentist a couple times a year for the obsessive ones. Okay, the reality, they were way into bathing for much in the Middle Ages, maybe too into it. They continued the Roman practice where a bunch of strangers got naked together for communal bathing. And most towns and even villages in medieval Germany had a communal bath where craftsmen would hang out together for a hard day's work. Just sitting there probably, washing each other's dongs and having loud conversations about how incredibly not gay they were. Okay, a few things to comment about it. It is correct that in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of communal baths. In particular, you can expect to have them in every big city. And if there wasn't a communal bath, you would probably have something like, say, a river. You would have people bathing at something like a river, the local lakes, stuff like that. That being said, while it is true that they are right that it's a myth that everyone smelled like shit, there still would have been people who smelled like, well, shit. Like, not everyone had the very good conditions. And, homeless people existed back then just as they do today. And also, it was generally best to get into the baths as early in the morning as possible, because the longer you took to get into them, the more people would have gotten into them, and the filthier the water would be. And also, well, look, the church did have some objections, and I bring it to the baths, and I bring this up because there was a lot of prostitution at the baths, because, keep in mind, while they are talking about incredibly not gay from a bunch of naked men sitting in the baths, it wasn't just men there. These baths allowed mixed gender bathing, where the men and women would bathe together naked. So yeah, this was a place where a lot of prostitution happened, which the Catholic Church had some objections to. So it wasn't just men in baths together, it was men and women in baths. Meanwhile, not only was it common for medieval folks to wash their hands before and after eating, which is true, it is also customary to offer to bathe with calves when they enter their home. Let's see their citation. The article doesn't exist. Home, something the man has repeatedly reminded us is no longer acceptable in modern society. Medieval demand for soap, made from animal fats, variety of oils, was until great 13th century. Some was made on almost industrial scale, alright, true, by Britain, France, and Spain. So why do we get a picture of everyone wallowing in their own filth back then? Well, things changed all at once. If only an act of God could change Europe's epic bathing culture, they got one in mid-14th century. The Black Death strolled up and kicked Europe right in the tooth with its pestilence boost. Suddenly, smart people were telling previously washed masses that bathing was a surefire way to open your body's pores and invite all the bad spirits or gremlins or whatever. Weren't too savvy on what caused illness back then. Okay, so is this true? Well, it is true that there was a decrease of bathing with the Black Death. However, communal baths didn't go away entirely. They still existed and would continue to, and even then people would bathe in other things. Well, why was there a decrease in bathing? Well, even if they didn't know exactly why, people did know that water could spread disease. And bathing with a bunch of people could end up resulting in, well, you getting a lot of sickness from being in a bath with a bunch of them. So that's why it caused people to bathe less, but it didn't go away. And people still did have communal baths even after it, so no, this is not entirely correct. As a result, by the end of the early modern period of history, bathing had become obsolete. And not true, there still was bathing. And once again, people in the early modern period, like, you can see rich people who had private bathtubs and private bathrooms, and people could still bathe in rivers. So it's entirely possible George Washington rated higher than Richard the Lionheart on the smell like shitometer. I mean, maybe, but people did bathe in these 1700s America. Like, it didn't stop, just slowed down a little bit in the bubonic plague. Now, number 4. Knights were honorable, chivalrous warriors. Well, I mean, by definition, if someone is a good knight, they're chivalrous. Like, we'll get to that, but anyway. The myth, knights were gallant and brave warriors, charging into battle to slay the dragon and rescue the fair maiden. I mean, I just removed the slay the dragon part because we all know that dragons don't really exist. Like, they're the closest thing we have are Komodo dragons, and maybe there was a knight who fought a crocodile at some point, but nah. In reality, knights had less in common with this, and more in common with this, and they show some gangsters, which, I wouldn't say it's accurate, or at least what they're saying is accurate. So, knights were professional soldiers, a noble class of them. And, quite frankly, if you add them, and quite frankly, I think knights had more in common with modern soldiers than they had with modern ideas of what knights are like, or were like. Like, a knight, whether in modern retellings of Arthurian legends or in Game of Thrones, is a lot less like a medieval knight than a modern soldier is. So, moving on, remember, knights were professional warriors. That is true, they were. And when there wasn't a war to fight, they had to do something with their war boners. Well, there were a few things that knights did when they weren't at war. One was, especially if they were a landed knight, serve as an administrative function. They'd resolve legal disputes for peasants. They'd train. They'd go to tournaments. They'd do all sorts of various small, minute things that needs to be done to administer a medieval society. Also, if you have a knight who was not landed or even landed, they could be a part of their lord's counselor. Now let's see, most of these guys were relatively young and didn't have call of duty to satisfy their violent urges. Okay, I suppose it depends on what you mean by relatively young. Knights, generally speaking, would have finished their training in their early 20s. Some would have finished it earlier, some a bit later, but you could expect that a lot of knights would have been in their 20s. Now, obviously, if they survived their 20s, they could live longer, potentially into their 50s, 60s, or even 70s. But once again, knight was a dangerous profession, so a lot of them wouldn't have, though a lot of them would have too. Okay, so he decided to take it out on the local population. So, source. Oh, the first. Say the new. Oh, that one. Okay, so anyway, take it out on the local population. Let's see what they mean by that. Towards the end of the 11th century, many of the local lords started bickering over who would get a slice of that Holy Roman pie that Charlemagne banked, and knights were at the forefront of these petty wars. Wars were less Braveheart-style battle, and more knights rolling up into village and slaughtering everyone. Okay, conflict between feudal lords throughout the Middle Ages was relatively common. How feudalism worked is you had a king on top, and below him you had a bunch of lords. And while they were technically under the king, they had a lot of autonomy. And if a knight, say, well, not necessarily a knight, but let's say a duke or a baron or a count wanted to go to war with another count, as long as they had a justification for it, there wasn't much the king could do to stop them. Even less so, perhaps, in the Holy Roman Emperor era, depending on who the current emperor was, because that was an elective monarchy, and the king, or rather emperor, had a lot less power, though once again, this did depend on the period, than kings did in other kingdoms. Now, next up, were knights at the forefront of them? I suppose it depends on what you mean by forefront and what you mean by knights, depending on the era. So, if you mean by at the forefront, that they were the shock troopers who would charge in first, then yes, they were. If you mean they were the ones causing those wars, not really. Knights were soldiers who were fighting in those wars for their feudal lords. They weren't the ones responsible for them happening, and if the knightly class never existed, they'd still have happened. Now, on the other hand, there were times in the Middle Ages, though after the 11th century in this case, where every noble was a knight. If you refer to knights by that definition of every noble, then yeah, you could say they were responsible, but let's be real here. Whenever someone is referring to a knight, even if they're talking about the periods where every noble was a knight, they're not talking about a duke or a count, they're talking about the low-ranking knights. Now, next up, did knights just roll up into villages and slaughter everyone? Well, sort of. So obviously massacres happened in many of these wars, but massacres of civilians still happen in wars today. This isn't anything new, and they happened before then too. However, the most common tactic was not just rolling into the villages and killing everyone. That happened, but by and large it would have been rare because, well, the various lords wanted people to work their land after they took over, and if they killed everyone in the village, there'd be no one left to work the land. And also, in the events where this happened, it wasn't just the knights doing it, it was the common foot soldiers too. In fact, if we look at, the sacking of Jerusalem, a lot of the nobles tried to save people, and I'm referring to it at the end of the First Crusade, but some of the nobles tried to save people who lived in the city, whereas the various common soldiers, and probably lower-ranking knights too, did slaughter just about everyone they could get their hands on. Now, if we look at a specific tactic that basically was the whole row into a village and slaughter everyone, or at least as close as it got, as an institutionalized tactic and not just something that has happened throughout the entire history of warfare, we have, I think it's called chivalry or something, or chevalier, or something like that. I have trouble pronouncing the name. And it was basically a very specific tactic used by the English in the 100 Years' War, or at least early on in it. I suppose you could count the harrying of the North by William the Conqueror as something similar, though not exactly the same thing. But basically, the harrying of the North by William the Conqueror was when he burnt down all the food in northern England, and chivalry is basically the English army going through France on a rampage, slaughtering people, burning down crops, stuff like that. Only in the case of the chivalry, which I think is more relevant than the harrying of the North, because it tends to more resemble slaughtering people in villages, it was a very specific tactic the English engaged in, and it wasn't just the knights who would have been doing it. The common foot soldiers would have taken part too, like I said. And in this case, it was done to basically try to get the French to fight them in battle, because the French, at this point, were using Fabian tactics against the English, and the English couldn't besiege the castles of France while the French army was out in the field. So they tried that tactic to convince the King of France to fight them, because if not, they were going to wreck his economy and slaughter his peasants. This ultimately didn't work. The King of France was unconvinced, and the English couldn't get any land, which actually reduced support for the land in England. Plus, going around slaughtering everyone didn't exactly endear the English army to the local population and make them want the King of England in charge of them rather than the King of France. The King of England instead of the King of... So this was a very specific tactic that was used at a very specific time and place by very specific people. Not saying it was a good thing even remotely. However, what I will say is that this wasn't the norm. This wasn't most medieval warfare. Yes, massacres happened, throughout all of history of warfare, but it wasn't like this was an institutional tactic of knights just going around all the time, because knights needed serfs to work the land, and if they killed everyone, there'd be no one to work the land. The church tried to curb these conflicts because, frankly, they were nasty and threatened the stability of everything. That's part of it. The Catholic Church, generally speaking, would prefer it if there was either no war, or if any wars that were fought were between Christians and people who weren't Christians. They generally didn't like it when Christians fought each other, though I say generally because there were plenty of exceptions. even the Catholic Church calling crusades against Christians. First, they tried to gather up all the knights and sent various body parts of dead saints at them, but when that didn't work, okay, yeah, I mean, that probably wouldn't have worked because, like, the knights worked for the lords. If you don't convince the lords to stop fighting, then, well, the knights, well, that wouldn't have, like, been, that wouldn't have worked. The knights would have just ordered the knights to fight, or the knights would, or the lords would have found someone else to fight for them, probably some mercenaries. And also, shake various body parts of dead saints, that's kind of an overcomplication. There were lots of methods the Catholic Church went on to try to reduce the fighting in Europe, including things like the Truce of God, where they basically said you're not allowed to fight on certain days of the week. These methods, by and large, did not work. But when that didn't work, the Pope called the First Crusade and explored all these assholes to Jerusalem, where they chivalrously ate babies and massacred the entire population of Jerusalem. Okay, so the Siege of Mara, what they're doing, calling citing this article. Okay, so during the siege, some of the starving crusaders resorted to cannibalism, feeding on the bodies of Muslims. This fact itself is not seriously in doubt, as it's acknowledged by nearly a dozen crusading chronicles written 20 years after, all of which to some degree are written by eyewitness accounts. The crusaders' cannibalism is mentioned in an Arab source in which they said racked to death. Okay, where does it mention babies? Let's see. Okay, so when multiple sources concur on the fact of cannibalism, both during its time and motive are thus in doubt. Another issue is where such acts were limited to Mahara or happened elsewhere, as some accounts suggested. Some sources of cannibalism described several months earlier during the siege of Antioch. The Byzantine princess Anna Kamene describes to an even earlier period the People's Crusade, defining in the way similar to Ralph of Caen. They cut into pieces some of the babies' wooden spits. Okay, let's and roast them over a fire. Okay, so this is the only time this mentions babies. And Byzantine princess Anna Kamene says that, and she is a very, very reliable source, like, according to the article Cracked is citing, says that it was the People's Crusade who did this. Which basically did have some low-ranking nobles and knights, but it didn't have most of the... it didn't have most... Okay, so the People's Crusade was mostly not knights. It was mostly various commoners. That being said, the First Crusade, most of its participants weren't knights either. They were, like, various people who were professional soldiers, commoners, like, guys there. There were just more knights than in the People's Crusade. Now, let's see. Ralph of Caen, according to Norman Chaplin, both of whom in this article say that cannibalism happened in the siege and suggest it was a public spectacle rather than a hidden episode. Ralph states that a lack of food compelled them to make a meal of human flesh, adults put in a stew pot, and children were skewered in spits, both cooked and eaten. He asserts that from the very perpetrators of this same, that is from some of the cannibals himself. Okay, but he doesn't say who the cannibals were, whether they were knights, common foot soldiers, or both of them. Now, this other guy, Albert, writes that the Christians in the face scarcity did not fear to eat the bodies cooked and fired, and then Fulcher states many crusaders Fulcher of Charles, who was a participant of the crusade, though not personally present. Let's see, thus implying that... Okay, so we have two sources mentioning babies, and one of them claims that it was done by the People's Crusade. The other claims that it was not necessarily, but that was, like, by other people. Two sources that describe the devouring of babies. One claiming that happened in the First Crusade, the other claiming it happened by the People's Crusade. But either way, this clearly wasn't a normal instance. They were under siege and were starved so much that they resorted to cannibalism. This isn't something they normally did. It was something out of desperation from starvation. So, while definitely horrifying, it isn't the norm. And also, once again, these sources don't mention who the main people involved in it were. Now, it's entirely possible that knights were doing it too, and quite frankly, I kind of expect everyone to do it if everyone was starving, though. So maybe maybe not, but in any case, once again, the First Crusade didn't just have knights involved. It also had foot soldiers, commoners, all sorts of other people, and the People's Crusade was even more full of commoners. And I addressed the massacring the population of Jerusalem thing earlier. There were cases of where the nobles involved in it did try to stop the massacre or at least save some people, whereas the most of the army did massacre. It wasn't just the knights doing it, it was just about everyone. Later attempts were made to get these young guns under control, one being the chivalric code adopted around the 13th century. So the 13th... Okay, so the chivalric code. Chivalry existed in the 13th... chivalry existed throughout the entirety of the history of knights and even before them. But what chivalry was depended on the time period. In its earliest iterations, chivalry was just being good on horseback. It gradually developed into something like a code. However, it didn't necessarily be accepted by everyone in the universal way. Everyone believed a knight should be chivalrous, but not everyone agreed on what chivalry was. Examples like Sir Lancelot and Edward the Black Prince. Okay, Edward the Black Prince is, he is often touted as an example of English chivalry, but he also was one of the guys behind that chivalry tactic. And also, I would not say Sir Lancelot was entirely of that. He was partly, but different medieval authors disagreed on that. The races show knights how to behave in battle and in peace. Knights were encouraged to defend the weak. Somewhat true, but it depends on who their lord was, and the church definitely did encourage that. But the weak was commonly interpreted to mean noble women and children, not peasants. And what's their source for this? Okay, so this not peasants thing, it's incorrect in a way. So, how medieval people would have thought of their class system was basically the French estate system, or at least in the period they're talking about. You have three groups of people. You have those who work, those who pray, and those who fight. Those who work support those who pray and those who fight. Those who pray, which would be the priests, protect the souls of the other two classes. And those who fight, those being knights and nobles, protect the bodies of the other two social classes. And knights did have incentive to protect the peasants, not just from the social system, but at least the peasants who were under them, because the peasants were the ones who were working the land of the knights. So if some other knight came in and started killing them, or even just some bandits, they wouldn't have anyone to work the land. Which basically means that the knights now have to defend them, because even if they don't necessarily care about the morality of it, they are certainly going to care about being out of money. So noble on noble violence may have decreased, but it was totally cool for knights to rape and kill peasants, since like those beers who have breakfast, they didn't really count. No, they did. Like, there were even ransoms increasingly for peasants who were captured. So, if you were to face a knight, there was a decent chance, at least in the late Middle Ages, that if you were a peasant and surrendered, they'd try to take you alive for the ransom, just like they would another noble. Though, noble ransoms were worth more than peasant ransoms, of course. 3. Everyone was a prude. The myth casual sex, even knowledge of how sex works, is a modern invention. During the heavily religious Dark Ages, sex was strictly forbidden outside of marriage, which is kind of true depending on things, and every single person of consenting age, loosely defined back then. Well, okay, was there citation? Oh yeah, so medieval maidens, young women. Okay, so I would say it was less loosely defined and more varied because different time periods in different countries disagreed on what the age of consent should be. Like, for a Viking in the 800s, what they thought would make you an adult was different from an Englishman in the 1200s. Led a life that was really a never-ending swell through a pool of self-repression. The reality, you know those really goofy-looking shoes that men wore back then? Extra pointy-eared ones, like something an elf would wear? Well, those are called polanes, and are made to represent the wearer's dong. And a revelation that will come as no surprise to anyone remotely familiar with the intricate relationship between man and his weighing. These things were sometimes so big dudes couldn't walk upstairs. This is true. Good thing they were wearing all these elaborate cod pieces to protect their actual dongs when their shoe dongs tripped them up. Okay, so here's the thing. The codpieces were a thing, as well as those shoes, and they were fashionable in some parts of the Middle Ages, but they weren't universal, and not everyone would have worn them even when they were fashionable. Like, not so, yeah. And the sexy didn't stop with the fashion. Prostitution was a big freaking deal back then, true. Although technically against the teachings of the church, everyone collectively agreed that if there were no hookers around, they would be out raping just everyone, because some of what you heard and it wasn't a myth. Okay, this is not true by their logic. So the church was against prostitution, generally speaking, though some of them obviously took part in it because corruption was a thing. However, the church's stance was basically that prostitution, while they disliked it, was to be tolerated because it was better than masturbation or being gay. Yeah, like, they basically, it was more their hatred of homosexuality and masturbation that prompted them to be in favor of prostitution because they didn't quite know how being gay worked. In most medieval cities, prostitution was completely legal, yet confined to certain districts and licensed by a town's mayor. Church even got this deal and licensed some holy brothels of its very own. Yeah, there were some people in the church who endorsed prostitution, or were part of it. Yeah. Let's not leave out the married folks. Since most upper-class marriages were political affairs and people getting married didn't necessarily like each other all that much, extramarital affairs were where it was at. And man, did things get down. If you ever watched a show like The Tudors and thought it was all sexed up for a modern audience, you were wrong. Okay, partly true, partly false. So obviously extramarital affairs did happen. However, there was a double standard regarding it. And it's pretty much the double standard that you might think it is. Extramarital affairs are perfectly okay if a man does them. If a woman does them, they are not okay. Which, partly because women are the ones who have to have children. So, like, they have to give birth. So, a man through an extramarital affair could end up raising a children that wasn't his own, and a woman couldn't necessarily do that. Though bastards were often cared for at courts, but in any case, quite frankly, I think that no one should have extramarital affairs, man or woman. But the attitude in the Middle Ages was, at least if you were a man, you get married for political and economic reasons, and if you want love, get a mistress. One of the reasons Eleanor of Aquitaine usurped, well, she didn't usurp Henry II, she tried to usurp him. She didn't succeed in the end. Was because Henry II apparently had more mistresses than Tiger Woods. Well, yeah, kings had a lot of mistresses. Well, depending on the king. I should note that not all kings had them. It was very common for them to, but to use a counterexample, Edward I never had any mistresses. He was completely faithful to his wives, and by wives, I don't mean he practiced polygamy. His first wife died and he remarried. Now, seeing that getting in bed with the king was a good way to get ahead of life, daughters of lower nobility, not necessarily lower nobility either, it could be pretty much any noble that the king got his hands on or wanderers around, basically became escorts and tried to become the king's favorite mistress, which worked out pretty well for Anne Boleyn until she married Henry VIII, and, well, when she married Henry VIII and became King of England, worked out pretty well, that is, until she was beheaded for allegedly banging too many people who weren't Henry VIII. Now, see, that's the double standard there. That being said, I don't think that's why Henry VIII had Anne Boleyn executed. That was basically a kangaroo court. He just wanted her dead. But the whole situation was still bad news for women, right? Because women were praised property back then. Well, too, women were treated as cattle. Now, I do agree that saying that women were treated as cattle is an exaggeration, and also, they said cattle. Okay, typically when people say that, they say treated as chattel. Chattel being an archaic word for property. I do agree that saying that they were treated as property for the Middle Ages, especially if you get into the high and late Middle Ages, is an exaggeration. Women still didn't have the rights they have in any Western country today. The myth? Europe during the Middle Ages is right up there with Taliban-ruled Afghanistan in the top 5 places it would suck to have a vagina. Okay, quite frankly, I think that Taliban-ruled Afghanistan is far worse for women than medieval Europe. Hell, it's worse for women than medieval Middle East. Women were wholly repressed and were treated as second-class citizens. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say they're worse. Well, it depends on if you're in Venice or something, because the concept of citizenship did exist in some places, but not everywhere. Their only responsibilities were to cook, clean, and squeeze out male babies on demand. Depending on your social class, cooking and cleaning could be some of women's, well, married women, assumingly. If you have servants who are women doing that, it's a bit different situation than if the wife of the house is doing it. And squeeze out male babies on demand. Okay, now let's see. The reality, up until around 200 years ago, Europe was a largely agricultural society. This is largely true. And the funny thing about backbreaking and often dehumanizing labor is it has had a weird way of equalizing people. Not really true, though once again, this would depend on social class too, but no, it doesn't. When literally every member of the family is out busting his or her ass off every morning to fend off the very real threat of starvation, gender roles and sexism suddenly don't seem all that important. Thus, when it came to household responsibilities, men and women were equals by default, since the women had to do all the same bullshit their husbands did. Okay, let's see their source for this. Okay, 3 age groups. Oh, I remember this source. I've read it before. Okay, so we're talking about farmers here in this case. This would be women of the lower estate who also, this would be 5th, women of the largest group, whose rights and duties were in the manorial custom, Planners Con Sheriff Peter Plowman's wife. Okay, let's go down. So, the peasant's wife. Which countryside, villain for your 4, peasant's wife was a partner to the husband in the way of that the ladies of the castle, wherever responsibilities was not. Yeah, so it is true that the more equality is found in the work done by men and women, the lower the scale. Peasant women were sharing the husband's labor and their charm. That is true. However, okay, let's see. Charge of children, husband landlords, bearing rental. Yeah, like they basically did have to do much of the same work. And many peasant women did not marry, so were eligible landholders. There were several options for unmarried women: remain as far as work and work for them, become servants. Okay, so yeah, like peasant women were hard means of survival, but they were more stable and secure in those lesser classes, and they enjoyed greater equality. Albeit their life is surer year than they have sufficiency than to have the highest estate. Okay, so it is true that women were more equal the lower down you went, but that being said, note that this is about work and responsibility on a nearly equal basis, and they say nearly for like the lower classes. They don't mean it was equal. The man, even in a peasant household, would have still been the head of the household. He would have expected his wife and children to listen to him. Even if that work was more equal, it still wasn't equal. And keep in mind that back then in the Middle Ages, you could legitimately get away with paying women less than a man for the same work. Like, for example, there was a woman blacksmith who was like the head blacksmith for the King of England, and she got paid 1/3 of what men would have been paid in the same position. Alright, now let's see. So, should time traveling ever be a thing? Never tell a medieval woman to make her husband a sandwich, because she'll probably go back over her peg breath in your face before snapping you like a twig. That is... Okay, so, first off, she'd probably go, why are you telling me to make my husband a sandwich? He's the one who should tell me that. Second, she'd probably go, what's a sandwich? And the story wasn't much different in the cities. If a dad owned a shop or a tavern, his daughters would help out, true. Sometimes a daughter would actually take over his family business and run it herself if her father became unable to. Yes, but it could also be the wife who was doing it, something that wouldn't really happen until much later in modern society. True and untrue at the same time. It kind of depends on what you mean, where you're at, which place you're at. There's a lot more nuance to this than you think. Women also ran the taverns in medieval England. In fact, women once ran England's entire beer industry. Okay, let's see the sort. Okay, Brewsters. Oh, okay, I know exactly what they're talking about here. So, it is true that women ran the beer industry of England, and in fact, a large part of medieval Europe. That being said, why did this happen? It happened because women were, well, expected to make beer because that was seen as something a wife had to do for her husband. Like, it was the woman's job in the family to make beer because of the whole gender roles thing. And while women were the ones who made beer, they weren't the only ones to do it. Monks, throughout the Middle Ages, would brew their own alcohol, and they would sell that too. So, while beer in the non-religious life and non-religious stuff was, by and large, the people outside of religion would purchase, or outside religious life would purchase beer from monks, it was by and large made by women because, well, they were expected to because of their gender role, and they ended up being able to monetize it. it'd basically be like if a woman in the 1950s made a sandwich shop because she was really good at making sandwiches for her husband. So, still based around gender roles. It's not quite clear when that changed. Okay, so it is actually fairly clear as the Middle Ages. It's clear as the Middle Ages went on and went into the early modern period, you increasingly got things like male-only guilds. Whereas guilds would have something for, like, except women before then. But that being said, there still, by and large, were women working. When and how it changed would have depended on time, place, and like I said, there's a lot of nuance to it. Women who weren't running taverns or growing crops who survived could join a covenant, which may not sound all that impressive until you just realize it gave them access to time that was extremely rare. Things could read and write in an age when the most powerful kings couldn't. Okay, so most kings probably could read and write in their native language. And a lot of them, especially later in the Middle Ages, could read and write in Latin. So, no, kings, plenty of them could read and write. And if they stuck with it long enough to become an avis, they were in a similar position of power to a male lord, only maybe even a little higher, seeing as they technically reported directly to King of Kings and all. Okay, not really true that... Okay, this would depend on the rank of the male lord, because not all lords were the same rank and had the same power. And the abbess didn't technically report directly to Jesus, it was more like they reported to the Pope, you reported to Jesus, so... And the Pope was always male. Alright, so now, life was horrible and everyone died young. Life in the Middle Ages is described as nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, I think I know who this is a reference to. And, okay, so the nasty, brutish, and short, I think that this is a Thomas Hobbes reference, which isn't a reference to the Middle Ages. He was talking about the state of nature. Food sucked, housing sucked, work sucked, everything sucked. Luckily, people didn't have to deal it for long, lived to 35 tops. Today, if you see an older character in movies in the Middle Ages, also a wizard. Okay, as for life being short, it might be true the average life expectancy was 35 years. We tend to overlook more word there. Average. Infant mortality was brutal since vaccinations against childhood disease didn't exist yet, and medicine was here, serious wounds and sick your leeched on your junk stage. Okay, medicine was more advanced than that. Like, they did have medical treatments and were capable of treating general battlefield injuries. That being said, yeah, they're right about this. They're right that this skews the average way down. But for a male living in 1500 managed to see his 21st birthday, he was expected to live around 50 more years at this point. Okay, no citations, but this, like, male living to see his 21st birthday, he was expected to live to be 50 more years. That'd bring him into his 70s. This is incorrect. Sort of. You could live into your 60s or 70s, but, like, it wasn't necessarily common or the norm. People did live a fairly long time, but it still was a lot of dangers that would have caused people to not live as long as they do today. Typical perception of medieval peasant is someone who breaks his back doing non-stop labor for lords who gave not a single fuck to his well-being. But your typical peasant actually worked around 8 hours a day. Let's see their citation. Oh, pre-industrial workers had a shorter work week. Oh, okay, so I know what they're talking about here. With long breaks for meals and naps. So, yeah, they did have that sort of thing. They did have more, they have some cases. Okay, so that depends on their job, too. If you were a farmer, you would, during farming season, have to work from sunrise to sunset. That's the reality of working on a farm, regardless of the period. But you wouldn't have to necessarily do it year-round, though that would also depend on what crops you're making. However, one thing that I would like to note is that your job was not the only piece of work you would have to do. Everything in these time periods would have taken a lot more work than in the modern day. Like, you can't just throw your dishes in the dishwasher and be done with it in the Middle Ages. You have to scrub them clean. You can't just say... and you could buy clothes if you were wealthy enough, but most people made their own clothes, or at least their wife did. Would depend on circumstance, culture, similar things, but generally speaking, the wife would have made the clothes. You also had to either make or purchase your own tools, though this would depend on what the tool is. Blacksmiths were a thing, but people would also have to do a lot more housework. Like, just... imagine every person having to, like, do their own building repair stuff for their house. Just simple day-to-day things were work back then, far beyond normal, well, far beyond what we expect today. And peasants get more time off than you do. Sunday was an automatic day off, and when you factor in long vacations at Christmas, Easter, Midsummer, plus all the saints' days, considering the Catholic Church, the Orange Saints, and medieval peasants were on holiday for a good 1/3 of the year. Sort of. Keep in mind all the manual labor you'd have to do at your house just to survive. And also, if you raised animals, you can't take a day off to not take care of them. Every day you have to feed the animals. You have to make sure that they're, take care of them if they're sick, stuff like that. Even if it's the middle of winter, you still have to do it. Because if not, they are going to die. So even if it isn't a day off, you'd end up, you still had to do a lot of work, especially if you had animals. Let's see, and medieval peasants were on holiday for, let's see. And since much of that time was accompanied by epic festivals, spent it getting shit-faced on various types of medieval ale, so not only they work less they also partied harder. Well, they party harder than me by default because I'm sober, I've never had a piece of alcohol, and if I somehow find a way to live for eternity, I will spend eternity sober. As it turns out, they weren't exactly living the lives of bare-bones sustenance either. It would depend on the person, because, not all peasants were equal. By and large, yeah, I agree, but there would have been some people who would have been poor in the Middle Ages, even by peasant standards, and would have been on bare-bones subsistence. There's a lot more nuance that they're giving credit to. By late Middle Ages, average earnest worker was making around $1,000 a year, significantly better than, from the University of Warwick. A very decent source, but I would like to note that in the Middle Ages, it's pretty much impossible to convert medieval times knowledge and currencies to modern ones because there's just too much variation. For example, you might have a chicken being worth, say, 50 pounds in one area of England, and in the next county over, it might be worth 5 pounds. So it's impossible to say for sure. Though, once again, that's the general good standard, I suppose. And while no one will argue that that level of income would provide lifestyles that would inspire rap lyrics, it did allow them to afford varied diets, the occasional luxury item, and plenty of ale to cover all the partying they were virtually required to do. How could you get a rap song out of that? What rhymes with kick shoes? Okay, varied diets. So, to an extent, medieval peasants would have mostly eaten plants. The meat they would have eaten would have been restricted to pork. If you count fish, that would be sardines and anchovies and other small stuff. Most of the other stuff was typically restricted to the wealthy. The occasional luxury item, sure, but yeah, and ale, yeah, though, once again, actually, the only thing I have to say is that ale, how expensive it would have been would have varied, and a lot of people, like I said, the wife of the household would have made the ale. So you wouldn't necessarily have needed to buy it, though, once again, people did buy ale, so yeah, there is that. Anyway, that was the article. I'll go back through it really quick and rate all the points. So, first point, the one on scientific progress was dead. Them saying the reality, I'd say mostly accurate. There are just a small bit of nuance that they didn't cover. Everyone smelled like complete shit. Mostly accurate. They tend to get more late Middle and after Middle Ages stuff wrong, as well as not explaining that, yeah, the medieval people were aware that being in water that was contaminated could spread disease. Also, knights were honorable chairs of warriors. I'd say mostly inaccurate, because, these various petty wars, while knights were involved with them, it was nobles of all kinds who were behind them. And also they're talking about the Crusades. They don't really mention that a lot of the things knights did that they're saying are bad, or in cases were bad, would have also been done by common foot soldiers. It wasn't just the knights. Everyone was approved, mostly decently accurate, but they didn't cover the double standard about what they did, but only a little bit. Were treated as cattle, fairly accurate, but they really are exaggerating the empowerment of women. And also not mentioning some things that were gender roles based, like the beer thing. And let's see. and also, so everyone was horrible and everyone died young. I don't know, I guess, like, fairly inaccurate since they didn't mention all the other stuff that you'd have to do to survive beyond your job. Thank you for watching, everyone, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe.